My name is Jason.
And my name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we explore an ancient network of tunnels full of strange, unfriendly creatures. No, not the London Underground, but it is an anomalous subsurface environment.
Our first segment is Basic Crawl.
Dungeon module ASE1, Anomalous Subsurface Environment, is an 89-page adventure for character levels 1 to 2, written by Patrick Wetmore. It is illustrated by Brian Glad Thomas and Andy Atom Taylor.
The book kicks off with an introduction that has 3 very helpful sections to it: running the dungeon, running the city, and advice for referees and players who are new to old-school style dungeon games. The bulk of the book is actually divided up into 2 major parts. The first of those major parts is the Denethix campaign setting. The Denethix section kicks off with a history of the world. This is directly from the text. The anomalous subsurface environment exists in a world much like our own, but several thousand years in the future. About the same time that the dungeon was sealed off from the outside world, the Earth suffered a cataclysm that ushered in an age of magic and barbarism. Some suggest a nuclear war, while others propose that a comet threw the moon out of its proper orbit. Regardless of how or why, the nature of the world changed profoundly. And then we have several sections that describe various factions within the setting, including orbital gods, the cult of science, the Church of Starry Wisdom, the goblins and their hive minds. This is an important note because a now gone hive mind is key to level 1 of the ASE dungeon. We also learn about the Land of 1,000 Towers, which is a sort of generic name for this countryside. We get lots of details about the city of Denethix, including its history, its law and society, factions, personalities, locations, nearby villages and towns, encounters, and rumors. Then we have a section on post-apocalyptic equipment, which is basically just guns. And then we also have, finally, a section on the cost of living and various things you can purchase in this setting.
The next major section is Wizards, giving you profiles of numerous sorcerous individuals who inhabit the nearby Land of 1,000 Towers. And then it is on to the anomalous subsurface environment itself, with a history of the dungeon, Mount Rendon, that's the mountain that contains the whole thing, and then the Gatehouse, which is the intro to the dungeon with 32 key locations. We have a factions overview, then level 1 named Dungeon Highway, which contains precisely 100 keyed locations. That too has factions, and those factions are followed by a section called Time Passes, the outside world. The dungeon write-up is followed by a section of magic items and a section on monsters, including such delights as corpse jellies, malignant spheres, mocktars, and screechmen. Now let's crash on to our bona fides. I have only read this. Jason, what have you done with ASE?
I have been a player in this particular module, and we should note, we kind of did at the top, but we're only discussing ASE1, which is Denethix and the first level of the Mega Dungeon. I believe there's another book, right, that has 2 and 3.
That's right, 2 and 3 are already published. I imagine at some stage lower levels of the dungeon will emerge. For now, we're just sticking to the city and level 1.
It's already very big with just level 1. But yeah, so I've been a player in level 1 of the dungeon. We didn't do any of the Denethix stuff, so that's that I've just read, but I have run through the dungeon part. Let's talk about things we liked. So I think I'll kick us off if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
This setting is a self-professed gonzo setting. The authors kind of say that right up front, or the author rather. And in this context, gonzo means it contains lots of elements that are seemingly incongruent with one another, right? And that's because it's a post-apocalyptic environment that has lots of what we consider to be like modern-day Earth things mixed in with these fantasy things that have built up since the apocalypse, right? It's a gonzo setting. I go back and forth on gonzo settings, like whether I like them or not. But this one is, I think what I like about it is it feels very, very believable. It's very believable. So you have these details that don't seem to fit, or they seem a little absurd or weird, but they're never like comic. Like, it's not really played for gags, I don't think. In isolation, some of these elements seem, well, kind of gonzo, right? But when you kind of take them together, it starts to feel very believable. And here's what I mean. There is in the module called out this little village called Lugosi, okay? Mm-hmm. And this village, Lugosi, which is a clear reference to the actor Bela Lugosi, who played Dracula in the sort of golden age, Universal monster films, right? Principally known for Dracula. In the village of Lugosi, we get all of these details that indicate like a sort of vampire aesthetic, right? So they have like a mausoleum, they have like a festival called the Festival of Fangs. And when you read about the village of Lugosi, I did when I read about it, I was like, this is stupid. Like, this is so stupid. Like, there's like Lugosi, really, like, that's so on the nose. First of all, there aren't even any vampires in the town. It's just like this kind of like weird vampire aesthetic, and they've named their town that. But the more I thought about it, and as I got deeper into the module and began reading about other parts of the world and things like that, and the history of the setting, I began to realize that Lugosi makes a lot of sense, because what's happened is, okay, Bela Lugosi is a feature of our modern day time. Vampire movies are a thing from our time. And then there was this apocalypse. And now 1,000 years later, this little bit of effluvia has managed to trickle down to these people, right? And so I imagine they built their little village around a mausoleum, and they remembered a mausoleum from this thing, related to someone called Lugosi, right? And so they kind of just created this. Well, really the great example here is like more traditional post-apocalyptic films, right? Like where they have characters that are named like, odd things, right? Or like an Apocalypse World, the game, like you have NPCs that are named, things like,
Toyota is one of the famous ones, right? So,
yeah, Toyota, right?
Which is going to come up later in this episode again. So yeah.
Yeah. I'm still in your thunder a little bit, but that's the idea, right? Like it's this idea that, okay, the way this world developed, this village of Lugosi makes sense to me, right? And there are other examples as well. So the orbital gods, okay, these are AIs that exist on these satellites that circle the planet, okay? So at some point before the apocalypse, we managed to come up with this, right? And these orbital gods can communicate with the people down on the surface of the planet through these, these lenses that are in these, quote, temples, right? But when you start to read between the lines, you realize that it's just computers, right? It's just computers that are in like laboratories or whatever, right?
Yeah. It's not even between the lines. I think it's the lines, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. In the city of Denethix, the descriptions of places and street names are incredibly literal, right? Like, there's no poetry to like what streets and locations are called. It's just like the street of pleasure, the alley of buying things or whatever, right? Like, it's this very, very like plain named things, right? There's no poetry to it. There's no creativity to it. But when you think about it, this society is kind of young, right? Like they've kind of, in their way, they're young. They've just kind of sprung up over time, or they haven't really had time to like develop anything else, right? Like they are the first of their people, right? In a sense. And so of course they're going to call things like that, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's a bit of a caveat here. When we say, oh yeah, sure, it's very believable. It's very believable after you've taken the leap that we get to, that an apocalypse causes magic. And then at that point, yeah, it all hangs together very nicely. And, well, actually, as we'll see later in one of my chain lightning bits, is there's also your ability to find reasons that things might have happened is quite strong. So you actually don't need to worry about that too much. Like, there could be any number of reasons that the village of Lugosi is so named. It could just be a massive coincidence. We'll never know. But you can always fill that in. And yeah, it does seem to be nicely, well, we often say lived in, don't we? Like the people that inhabit this place seem to have like believable concerns about themselves. And even though they're living in a world where you have immortal sorcerers and kind of robots and strange hive mind goblins, you can kind of buy all the motivations, which I think is really good.
You said it hangs together. I think that's kind of more what I meant, right? And that's what I like about it. Like, in play, I don't think you're going to delve into this stuff, right? Like, that's, like, I mean, and it might even like come across as kind of funny in play if like you go to the village of Lugosi, right? Like, everybody might find that to be more of a comic moment. But I was just, I'm just commenting on the idea that like when you take in the module as a whole, it all really hangs together and it all really feels like well considered, right? And not just absurdity, right? And so I really like that about it. Other examples like referencing sick rock, which is pretty clearly uranium, right? That kind of thing. Yeah. Little details like actual real world artworks and things like that kind of litter the landscape. The way that we have demi-human races is super interesting, right? And because one of the things that is kind of funny about the setting is it was our Earth, but Apocalypse, like you said, caused magic, and now suddenly there are dwarves and elves and things, and so we have to account for that. And it's accounted for in this really interesting way, whereby these alien hive minds were trying to do experiments, basically, and ended up with elves and dwarves and halflings, right? And so, yeah, it all just feels, like a believable world. And I think, like, the sort of counterpoint here for me is, so the last module we covered was Sacre Bleu, right?
Yes.
And I mentioned that it felt like a hodgepodge to me, right? That's also kind of a gonzo setting because it has these sort of strange anachronistic elements to it, right? But in my opinion, I like Sacre Bleu. I think it's really good. But in my opinion, it does not feel as believable as this. It feels a little bit more random and not quite as cohesive. Whereas this, taken all together, feels quite cohesive and really good.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's one item in ASE that I think that among the factions that doesn't really work for me, which is the Church of Science, which is an amusing enough satire it's as accurate and on the nose as the other things. But I don't know. It seems a little too obvious to me. But then that's just my opinion. And as we may discuss later, you don't have to absolutely love everything in this kind of quite multifaceted setting, because other people in your group may like it more than you do. One thing I do like is the Church of Starry Wisdom, for example, which is a reference to the sinister cult that worships various mythos things in Lovecraftiana. And they are very, they're appropriately sinister. They're kind of the bad guys, I think. Well, there's a lot of bad guys in the setting, but they're the ones who will be actively seeking out things in the subsurface environment while your PCs are wandering around. They'll be the ones sneaking up to them and offering them like dodgy, like back alley deals for treasure they find. And it's very smart, I think, to use the fact that you're doing a cross-setting, as in you're able to refer to things that players will know about out of character, and use that loaded Lovecraftian, the fact that it's Nyarlathotep, a bad guy, god figure that they'll have heard of, to put them at disease, because this church is quite accepted inside the city of Denethix. So in character, they kind of have to go, oh, yeah, I know those guys, they're fine. But of course, they'll be on edge, right, even before the big reveal, if there ever is a reveal. The thing I like most about the factions in the Denethix city setting, and the way that they then extend into your exploration of the dungeon, is that they're not actually totally opposed to each other. They're just sort of working in different directions, by which I mean that, like, it's really easy. And I think we all kind of are a bit prone to this, maybe when you're sorting out your fronts for an Apocalypse World game, or, setting up a setting, that you have factions who are just enemies. And so anything that is a gain for one faction is a loss for the other. And they're kind of immediately butting up and in conflict. Whereas in this, they're just kind of at, like, approaching awkward angles. And so the things that the Church of Starry Wisdom want compared to what, say, the people running the city are interested in aren't directly opposed yet, but they might be in the future as they circle around the ASE, and that creates this, to coin a phrase, fruitful void, where all kinds of interesting things might happen in the middle of that as they get closer towards one another. And of course, your PCs are going to be right there in the middle of it as this valuable dungeon opens up, and kind of acts as a lure for all the factions and people who are interested in wealth and power in the area.
Some other things that I liked, I thought Denethix was also a pretty terrific setting. I particularly loved the tables that you get for the city of Denethix. They are really, really terrific tables. I think the last time I saw a set of tables like so inspiring that made me just want to jump in and run that setting was probably Yunsuin. And these are good tables. Like they really give you so much flavor for the city. Just terrific stuff. I also like that the dungeon portion is presented with quite a bit of flair, a lot of flair. There is this theatricality to it, which I really enjoyed. Like certain parts of it almost reminded me of like video game cutscenes in a way. And I was reminded of, what's that module we did?
Oh, are you talking about the Warlock of Firetop Mountain? Because I too was reminded of that, but I think this is better at doing what that was trying to do, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to say. Like, I was trying to think of the name of it. I was like, I know it's from Tom's Homeland. They're very proud of it. It's a ripoff of Keep on the Borderlands.
No. Whoa. Just to clarify, the thing that British people like is the Choose Your Own Adventure game book, not that one, right?
Okay, right.
Yeah. I mean, let's be clear here, okay? Carry on.
No, but that's what I was going to say. It reminded me of that, but it's much better. You might recall, listeners, if you've been with us for a while, in Warlock of whatever,
Firetop Mountain.
Thank you. There are these moments that are so staged, right?
Yeah.
When you walk into this room, this Minotaur is going to be doing this thing, or this orc will be lashing this goblin, or this creature will say this thing to you. It's like super, super staged. This has a similar feeling. Like there is this sort of theatricality to the presentation of the rooms in many of them, but it's not quite so staged. There's a little bit more flexibility in like what might actually happen. But it's the same idea, this idea of like performing the dungeon. Like here's a great example. In the anteroom, which is keyed location 22 of the gatehouse, when players enter this room, a transparent man, dressed in clothing of a long-gone era, will appear in the middle of the room and begin his spiel. Welcome, visitors and employees, to the Subsurface Research Facility. As you prepare to enter the subsurface environment, remember to follow your expedition checklist and listen to the instructions of your guide at all times. We have been accident-free for 3,729 years, 11 months, and 2 days. A company record. Don't be the team to break it. That reminds me so much of like video games like Portal or like BioShock, right? Like it's got that kind of like feeling to it, right? There are just several little moments like that. There's another moment later on, I'm not going to read it, but there's another moment where like you flip this lever and you describe all these like interesting noises and crashing sounds going on deep within the dungeon. And then finally, the noise will subside. This is the quote. The klaxons will cease and the glowing square will now read, all entrances open, ready, right? It's just got this nice flair to it, the cinematic quality that I think is really good.
Yeah, and actually this brings me to, I think we need to discuss the dungeon in a broad overview, because this is what I think is the absolute best thing about this dungeon. Even if you ignore all the 100 rooms of that first level, we need to talk about what the ASE actually is. So
130 with the gatehouse.
Well, that is a good point, actually, yeah. But the anomalous subsurface environment is so named because it was first explored by people in kind of our era or our sort of futuristic science fiction future. And it's a weird space that is a self-maintaining dungeon complex that is fundamentally kind of unknowable. And these sci-fi researchers were plumbing its depths a bit like, what's the name of that other space that appears in House of Leaves by that Danglevsky guy? But it's a sort of strange, like, it's not an alternate world. It doesn't like exist outside the TARDIS, like outside the physical confines it should. But it's this area inside a mountain, buried away, that for some reason creates tunnels and traps and chambers, right? That they were trying to get through, and they were discovering strange materials that they were then using in unbelievably advanced science fiction technology. And then, of course, after they'd been there for, years and years and years, and all their families had moved in, there was a disaster. The whole thing was sealed off. And that little passage that Jason has just narrated for us is the point at which the player characters manage to unlock it again. And entrances open at several levels. I think, is it all 8 levels? Maybe.
I believe so.
Yeah, levels up and down the mountain. Now, and this is where it gets good, right? Because a dungeon inside a mountain, nothing particularly new. Keep on the Borderlands, thank you very much. And indeed, one where the easiest level is at the top, also not that new. But here is the quote from the text. As the dungeon is organized top down, the entrance the players know of will be at the top, and will be the one entrance that is not made known to the world. If the players can keep it a secret, they will have their own private entrance into the easiest sections of the dungeon. So what that means is, and as the little timeline that's included also conveys, local authorities will be showing up with their soldiers and attempting to go in at the lowest entrance, which is the most deadly and presumably has all kinds of appalling monsters inside it, right. Absolutely massacring everyone who turns up. Meanwhile, your PCs are kind of quietly, obligatory reference to Treasure of the Sierra Madre here, kind of quietly leading their mule train up the mountain and hoping nobody spots them to go to their secret easy entrance to grab all the cool loot that's inside.
I'm pretty sure you're on 3 references to that film in the last 3 episodes.
I think I am too, yeah. And with good reason in this case. I'm gonna I'm gonna claim, because it's keeping secret your source of treasure then becomes, and this is what's so interesting. I think even if you ignore the kind of quality or lack thereof that might be in the dungeon, this fact that you've suddenly got this interesting thing where the PCs, who are levels 1 to 2, bear in mind, in theory for this, are in possession of an incredibly powerful secret. And that is something that is, every decision you're making inside the dungeon or back in the city is going to be kind of influenced by that. And I think that's a really great group dynamic to have. We know the secret of this entrance. No one else does. That's just great drama fodder, as well as action stuff in a dungeon. It's great.
Indeed. No, that's awesome. Yeah. It just goes to show that, and I think this is kind of what we're getting at here, the author has taken a lot of care in how this dungeon is presented, right? There's a tremendous amount of care, not just the dungeon, but the whole setting. Like, it feels so carefully considered, but you kind of don't get to that until you, like you said, you have to kind of like suspend your disbelief a little bit. You have to kind of accept some kind of basic kind of, in some cases, eye-rolly things about the setting, right? And how it came about. But once you kind of get past that, you start to see that every part of it has been very well considered. And that also extends to something else that I really, really love about this module, which is that section that we kind of briefly talked about in the beginning, where the author gives advice about running the city, running the dungeon, and importantly, running old school modules. I love that section. It's about 3 or 4 pages, and it is packed with practical advice. And it makes me wish that this was the first OSR thing I ever read or ran.
Yeah.
Because I of course, I don't come from the OSR. That's not my scene. I come from like story games and indie games, but I have an appreciation for the OSR and what the OSR does, obviously, because I co-produce an award-winning podcast on it. Yeah. Right. But like, I wish that ASE had been my intro to the OSR, because I think that introductory material does such a great job of like explaining how, as the referee, you should approach running the games. There's just a lot of good practical advice, a lot of things that may not be super obvious, but feel obvious after you read them, right? Mm-hmm. It's worth picking up for that, in my opinion. Maybe not just for that, but combined with this amazing dungeon and setting as well. It's really, really great value. Anything else you want to call out that you loved about the...
No, not particularly. Although, as a quick side note, I do want to mention one of the monsters I quite like. It's called the Jawhead, and it looks uncannily like that weird flower monster thing from season 1 of Stranger Things. But of course, this came out first, so
I know. I'm like, I hope the authors of ASE are getting their cut from this, like, their Netflix riches, because I looked at the picture after you wrote that note, and I was like, oh yeah, it is that. Yeah,
it's exactly that thing. Yeah,
I do have one more thing I want to call out. Another kind of a smaller thing, like your flowerhead monster. There's a magic item called the Malicious Mirror in the book.
Oh, and this is so good. Yes,
it's delightful. It is the most delightful magic item. I love it. It's this. The short version is it's this mirror that kind of shows you one of numerous possibilities, like strange, horrifying images, right? But importantly, it can't be destroyed, and it always wants to get in front of you. So if you bring the mirror to, like, you take the mirror out, you sell it to an innkeeper or something, that mirror will always try to position itself for maximum horror, right? Like, you can't stop it. It will always be there where people can look at it and see all the terrible, scary things. And there's a table associated with it that has like all the different entries. And we're running a little long, so I'm not going to read the one that I selected. But basically, they're just these kind of very scary images and things. And the behavior of the mirror, this sentient mirror that is always trying to like freak you out and maybe even trying to like show you how you're going to die and stuff like that. There's just so much possibility for like sort of like spin-off horror stories from this. I think it's a great item.
Yeah, it's really cool. I like it a lot. I mean, I'd probably bring it in the dungeon with me just in case I can show it to some goblins or something. But
right, yeah. Let's talk about things we had questions about. I have one question. There is a relatively small amount of art in this thing. Compared to its size, there's not that much art. Do you think that's a hindrance or an advantage?
That's a very good question. I'm going to guess that the reason you might be suggesting it could be an advantage is because that allows you to, develop your own sense of how everything looks and not be tied down to certain imagery. I think it is an advantage in that sense. I don't think I want to see more pictures of I don't want to see a picture of a goblin. There's got a description of what they look like. They've got little needle teeth and so on. Fine. And elves as well, actually. So I don't think I want to see more pictures of things in the setting. I would maybe have liked to see a bit more quote unquote design, just like little graphic elements to make it easier to navigate through. Because once you get into the 100 keyed entries, it starts to be a lot. But no, I don't think I don't think it is a weakness. No. And actually, I think once you get this to the table as well, you stop reading it page by page and you start reading it numbered section by section. And at that point, it doesn't become important.
My thoughts on it, and I pose the question, obviously, because I have thoughts on it. So I was a player in this. And so when I first experienced ASE, I did not know anything about the setting. It all was, we're just kind of getting airdropped into it, right? And this was not an ongoing campaign either. This was just like 2 or 3 sessions, right? Experiencing it as a player, there's that sort of thing that you kind of called out earlier, this idea of the GM is describing things to me that I know what it is as a player, right? Like I know what it is. Like I recognize the references and stuff, but my characters don't. But knowing what it is, like, kind of helps inform the overall experience for you, right? Mm-hmm. And part of the fun was the GM having to kind of describe things without just showing us something or without just outright saying what it was, right? And so there was a certain pleasure in that I think would have been minimized if the GM had just a picture of it, right? But on the other hand, now having read it for purposes of this show, there were big parts of it where I kind of wish I had pictures, right? I was like, I kind of wish I had, like as a GM, I kind of wish I had some pictures. So it's a, I don't know where I fall on the question, but I thought it was interesting to ponder. So
that's an interesting one. Yeah. Going back to your experience of it. So you did like a few sessions. A lot of what I like in my read through seems to me like it would only kind of would play out or become obvious over the course of quite a few sessions, like at least 5 or 6, probably, I'd say. Like it seems like a lot of the fun is the developing timeline and kind of having to take stuff back to the city and do several expeditions. How did it feel? Is it distinctly different from other dungeons when you have a shorter game like you had?
It's an interesting question, and I saw your note, obviously. I think it mostly just comes down to like scope, right? Like if we were playing like 8 to 10 sessions and we were going to be doing that stuff that you described, then that would certainly change my opinion of it. But we only had a couple, I think it was maybe 2. It might have been 3, but I think it might have only been 2. I can't quite recall. This is a long time ago. But this sort of like shorter time frame thing that we did, which was just the dungeon part, that was fun in its own way. I mean, there was a certain pleasure to, all the little like theatrical moments that happen in the dungeon and all the sort of like picking up on the modern day references and all that stuff like that. All that stuff was like very pleasurable in its way. It was totally disconnected from Denethix. It was totally disconnected from the factions. Like we didn't get any of that. So yeah, I guess that's my answer. My answer is it was still enjoyable. It was just different.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I just wondered, would it feel like it was any other fantasy dungeon, but clearly not.
Oh, no, not at all. No, not at all. Yeah.
Cool. And so a sort of follow-up to that then is we're only looking at ASE1, and levels 2 and 3 have been published. But I kind of feel like for this to work, I think even especially for the GM, you need to have the promise of things being in the lower levels, right? So if you're the GM, what's quite good about the construction of the dungeon is lots of the rooms refer to other rooms or things you're going to find later. And I think you'd need to have in the back of your head some, not like a plan of exactly what's going to be on levels 4 through 8, but like a rough idea of what really nasty monsters are down there or what kind of strange facilities. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of early companion adventures territory. But like, are there any kind of existing things that you personally might throw in as a lower level, or what kind of features would those levels have for you if you were going to run this?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, because I don't know what's in 2 and 3. I haven't looked at that. So okay. First of all, I don't even know what happens in 2 and 3. But let's pretend. Let's just play pretend for a minute. What I always want in things like this is to have the themes reinforced, but on a bigger, more terrifying scale. And so I would like to see, in level 1, the characters randomly run into the Mona Lisa, right? Or Michelangelo's David, right? I would like to see that idea of artifacts and relics of our world kind of like somehow heightened and made more significant in the deeper levels. Like maybe they find the Ark of the Covenant or something, or I don't know, or they find the Holy Grail, right? So maybe something like that. I also think that it would be interesting if we got more evidence of kind of like what happened, right? Like I think I'd want to see that, right? So I think I would just want to take like whatever this sort of like overarching themes are that we've been exposed to already, just kind of taken to like times 10 as we go lower. But okay. I don't know what that means exactly, but
no, it's good to think about. Yeah, I was thinking I'd probably want it to seem a bit like in Operation Unfathomable, we have that idea that you get into a mythic underworld, so it would get like stranger and like bigger chambers as you got lower down, and kind of obviously more and more hellish monsters. And then I would probably like to have just one level that's really incongruous, that's like maybe the hotel from The Shining all of a sudden, like
that's cool. Yeah
All right,
well, chain lightning round. Tom, kick us off.
Blade zombies. They are zombies with blades through their hands and coming out of their eye sockets and stuff, and they seem to me like something your 11-year-old brother would draw on the back of his pencil case, and they are cool.
If you go roaming around outside of Denethix, those lands, you can find an offshore arcology, which is described thusly. A massive structure of steel somehow still stands in the deep waters of the western interior sea, supporting a small, domed city. Fishermen who have ventured near and avoided fouling their rudders in the debris field around the platform report men and pale, almost men, peering curiously at them from inside the dome. I
like some of the advice from the intro section. Specifically, I like this devil may care but admirable approach to using different OSR materials, which is this. I quote, "I recommend using stats as written in this book and not bothering with any conversion work for monsters that have slightly different stats in the rules you've chosen to use. The differences are minor enough that the conversion is not worth the effort." Have truer words ever been spoken in an intro? Probably, but this is good.
There is a bank in Denethix called the Bank Inviolable, which, obviously sticking with our aforementioned straightforwardly named locations. It has these sort of large mechanical guardians, and I want to read the description there. They're called custodians of fiduciary duty. A custodian is a man-shaped machine of iron and gold standing 20 feet tall with eyes like searchlights. They have integral machine guns in pods on their forearms to annihilate potential thieves and likely any unfortunate standing too close to the intended target. 2 custodians oversee the bank lobby and 2 stand in the vault. The custodians are rumored to be able to divine the intent of thieves through mystical means, as they will occasionally fire on the individuals waiting in line, reducing them to a fine red mist. An alternate theory is that the custodians are violently insane, randomly picking off innocent bank patrons.
As alluded to earlier, I also like the author's attitude to ever explaining anything for any reason, as follows. It is also possible to play the anomalous subsurface environment in a generic fantasy setting. Just let the contradictions and anachronisms remain, and leave it to the players to come up with some theory about how the stranger aspects of the mega dungeon came to be.
And finally, I mentioned it earlier briefly, but there are classical works of our own world that you can find in the dungeon, and they have their values listed on them, and this is pretty amusing. The Mona Lisa is worth 300 gold pieces. Starry Night is 200 gold pieces, and Michelangelo's David is 500 gold pieces. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. Today we are talking about playing in a gonzo setting, and I want to note here that we have kind of talked about this a little bit in one of our very early episodes, Sailors on the Starless Sea, I believe.
Yeah.
But in that context, we talked about how to play a funnel adventure in a way that didn't turn out to be gonzo. And at that time, we were kind of using a definition of gonzo that meant just like comic, right? Or absurd. And in intervening time, I have like started to have a more refined or different definition of the term gonzo. And in the context of ASE, I think that definition is a setting which the elements feel incongruent with one another, right? And not necessarily even played for laughs. It's just kind of sort of like strange, almost random seeming elements kind of jammed together in a setting, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And Tom, do you have any thoughts on like definitions of gonzo and things like that?
Yeah, I think you're right with that overview. Its use in gaming, and particularly in OSR, when describing scenarios and so on, tends to refer to things that have elements of the absurd, the grotesque in the sort of general sense of the word. One of the reasons I wanted to have this as our expert delve as well is because, when we talked about the Starless Sea, and we've kind of a few times talked about how to run scenarios and make them a bit less gonzo, and a bit of the old internet feedback has sort of made it clear that people think that's because we think doing stuff in a gonzo way is intrinsically bad somehow, but that's not the case. When we were talking about it in Sailors on a Starless Sea, the reason was because that module has you 100% covered for playing things in an outrageous, freewheeling, and grotesque and absurd style. You only need tips if you want to do it differently. I kind of want to talk a little bit initially about the merits of a gonzo setting for games, specifically like for fantasy games, although as ASE kind of demonstrates, it can be a sci-fi thing as well, or indeed pretty much any genre. And then maybe we can talk about sort of ways to be an effective participant in that kind of game as well.
I'd like to just add as well to our listeners that we frequently also say, if you want to play in a comic, absurd, gonzo way, you should do that. Like, we're not saying don't do that. We're just saying if you prefer not to do that, like in case of Sailors in the Starless Sea, we were making the case for a more serious, emotional approach to the funnel, right? But that's not a judgment against.
No, I mean, bear in mind, I ran that scenario.
Celebrity Big Brother thing, yeah.
Which I'm sure we're gonna mention later as well. And actually, I also found a good definition of gonzo from the Hacker's Dictionary. Hunter S. Thompson's original meaning, allegedly, although I've read his letters on this, I'm not totally sure he said it directly himself, but it's good.
This has become the thing, yeah.
And his meaning was with total commitment, total concentration, and a mad sort of panache. And I think if you bear those three things in mind when playing or running a game, you're going to have a good time. So, all right, I'll crack on with some opening thoughts about gonzo stuff. One thing I think that for OSR games in particular, a gonzo setting, as you say, a setting with a lot of incongruous elements has going for it is that it's very, very easy to use all different kinds of OSR materials. They're all roughly compatible because they have a similar kind of system grammar behind them, but they're often in very different settings and genres, or they have different expectations to them. But if you're running a game where the expectations can change from moment to moment or place to place, then that means it's not a problem anymore. And it also makes life easier for the GM to decide, what adventure am I going to run next? You can just kind of follow your impulses. You see something, you go, oh yeah, I want to run that. You can. You don't have to sit and think, does this really fit in my ongoing Dragonlance game? No, right? If you're running DCC or something, you want to run Dead Planet immediately after Scenic Dunsmouth, you can do that. You just need a portal or a wizard or something. And doing that, you do create a unified aesthetic eventually, but it's not through selecting things and excluding things that don't fit the plan. It's by agglutination, by mixing things together to go from red and blue to purple. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And you can actually kind of see this in action a little bit, or in practice, I should say, with the books published by the Hydro Cooperative. We mentioned Operation Unfathomable a little bit ago, but I think that all their books connect up in this way, right? I'm pretty sure they're all part of the same universe. I could have that wrong, but I think they are, maybe.
Well, even if you are wrong, that kind of also proves the point, because if they seem like they go together, then they do, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of makes sense. This is maybe not as great an example, but the Lamentations settings or modules all connect up together too. And some of those are a little kooky, right? But they all kind of like manage to hang together in their way. So yeah, no, I think it's, you can kind of see it. You can kind of see it in practice out there.
And sort of related to that is that I've found, my main experience for this is I was in a very long running, it's still running. I was in a DCC campaign for 2 or 3 years, run by Claytonian, formerly reviewed on this podcast. And one thing I noticed about this is you kind of get to choose how invested you're going to be in the game, sort of from session to session. More strongly, I would say from character to character. You can decide, I'm going to play like a silly character that I don't really care that much about this time. Or you can have a more intense character drama, and you can sort of do 1984 style doublethink as well by doing both at the same time. You can be playing a character who's experiencing very deep emotions about, being orphaned by a lion man attack on the plane of chaos. But at the same time, you as the player are kind of enjoying it. And you can kind of dip in and out. And I found that happen quite a lot. I spent quite some time playing a frankly ludicrous elf who, learnt some spells, was a failed sculptor, and that's why he'd been kicked out of his elf town because he was too lame to stick around elf town. That was his comical backstory, but I kind of started to identify with that guy a little bit, and that's one reason I kind of stopped playing him, because as long as I don't get him killed, he's still out there somewhere having adventures. Yeah, so it's really interesting the way that a gonzo setting can go from being daft fun to sometimes being quite intense. And I think if you think about my example here is Slaughterhouse 5. A novel that is not exactly comical, but it is funny. It has alien abductions and time travel that are treated like an absolute joke. But also have serious kind of philosophical points in them. And then there's the firebombing of Dresden. So it's it's not laugh a minute all the way through. And then some classic horror stories will do that. Robert Bloch and H.P. Lovecraft took turns writing fairly straightforward horror stories that were horrific, but also killed the other author off in a sort of Roman Eclair way. So that's it. It's very possible to just how you're feeling on the day is what you can commit to the game that day. I think that's really good. You don't if you're in a kind of a game that's always one tone and you don't feel like that tone this week, well, you kind of out of luck. But with Gonzo, you can kind of pick what you're going to do.
Yeah, well, and I think it's really interesting because I think what we're kind of saying here is that there is this really important meta quality to playing Gonzo well, right? And to enjoying it, right? We've already said a few times, there's a certain pleasure in your character discovering the Mona Lisa, right? Mm-hmm. Or your character understanding the Lovecraft references in ASE, right? That has your player rather, you understanding the references, even if your character does not, that has a certain pleasure to it. And I think that kind of just goes to this notion of you as the player get to decide how much you want to go in and on that stuff, right? And how much you want to really participate in the Gonzo aspects. I don't know if this is a counterpoint. I don't think it's a counterpoint. I think it's basically agreeing with you, but I kind of feel like it's really important to play all this stuff really straight. What do you think about that? is even if you're going to go with like a goofy character, named Toyota or whatever, like, do you play that straight, or are you kind of...
No, that is a great point. Actually, now that you say it, I think that is the most important thing is, and when you say play it straight, I think maybe it's the kiss of death if you have characters who are themselves in on the joke.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Because then that's when we get into the sort of silly, fluffy, anything could happen, but in a not good, not like, I was about to say consistent way, but of course, yeah. Gonzo games aren't consistent, but the characters in them think they are.
Precisely. That's the key. The characters believe their world, right? And so there's that like meta quality, and so in my opinion, I think you play it straight. I think it's a little bit like horror too, right? Like the reason why one of the ways you can be super effective, we discussed this before, but one of the ways you can be super effective in delivering horror at your role-playing game table, a difficult task because we're usually playing in brightly lit areas and we don't have production values, right? In the way we play. One of the ways you can help convey it is to play it serious, right? Like where you create space of like, well, this is just the reality of it. This is our reality. And creating that sort of like, creating that space at the table, I think helps magnify the desired feeling, right? And I think it might be kind of a similar thing going on here, right? Like play it kind of straight, play it like your characters believe it, and you can still enjoy it as a player, right? You can enjoy the funny aspects as a player without kind of driving it off the cliff.
Yeah, totally. Like that sounds like it's a serious kind of finger wagging point, but it's not. You're just gonna have more fun that way. So yeah.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. I love your next note where you have the word intertextuality written down, which is rapidly turning me on, Tom. What is... do tell.
Yeah. Well, intertextuality, you'll also notice the next three words are bold claims department. So welcome to the bold claims department. The minister will see you now. And my bold claim is that Gonzo D&D is the most genuinely literary RPG genre. And I will attempt to explain that. I'll be honest with you. I'm not totally like sold myself on this hypothesis, but let's see where it goes. Right?
This is a lab. It's an experimentation. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Other games ape existing media, whereas the Gonzo SR, as I've decided to call it, has a similar creative process to someone who is writing a new non-genre novel. Please direct any comments non-genre to the arguing about books department for further processing. We will not be discussing that here. But by that, what I mean is, things you find in the literature section in the bookstore. Yeah. Slaughterhouse 5, 100 Years of Solitude, I don't know, something by David Mitchell, not the comedian. Not necessarily good novels like, Paulo Coelho's The Zahir, I imagine, would be there. That was dreadful. But it's, so if you think about the way that, the modern novel happens... Yeah, let's talk about Slaughterhouse 5. That is a thing that is not in a particular genre. It's got science fiction in it, time travel, aliens, war, but it's not attempting to be something else again. It's taking things and it is copying things from pre-existing media. If you look at that, or if you look at a lot of the work of, say, Don DeLillo, he's forever recycling things from his own childhood, basically. Talking about baseball and stuff that he heard on the radio, advertising and so on. And recontextualizing it, and that's what Gonzo games of D&D do. The fact that you're making references to people in the real world, celebrities or TV shows, sometimes often with exactly the same names, because IP lawyers have no dominion over you when you're running a D&D game. No. I think that is a similar creative crucible where you're melting everything down to create new things. Now, please destroy this proposition, Jason.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not going to destroy it. I think it's interesting. I think it's super interesting because what you're essentially saying is that the sort of Gonzo OSR, as we have, covered in various modules from the show, is not of the fantasy genre. That's a pretty bold statement.
Is that what I'm saying? No, but I know.
That's kind of what you're saying.
I'm starting to agree with it, just because, or rather, it may be in the fantasy genre, but it doesn't have to be, and it's not created in the same way as a D&D supplement is.
Precisely.
Right? Yeah. It doesn't exist necessarily in that world, and that's one of the brilliant things about the OSR as well, is that we're talking about intertextuality. The fact that there exists, for example, Operation Unfathomable, and you know that you're in a game that is not necessarily set in the Forgotten Realms, means that in the back of your mind as a player, if you're aware of this ecosystem that exists, the fantastical, even if you're not doing anything outside a certain restricted setting, that it might turn up, and you don't know that possibility of the fantastical continues to exist, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's super interesting. No, I'm here with your thesis. I'm into this. This idea of it is the most genuinely literary RPG genre, gonzo D&D. Your next note is postmodernism. Maybe expound upon that.
Well, this is it's a subnote under intertextuality, but it's sort of talking about how like our experience of the real world affects what we experience in the game, and it can go the other way. We'll come back to that. So here's an example. If back in 1992 I was running D&D and I had an affable villager and I described him as looking like or being played by O.J. Simpson, the reaction to that would be quite different from if you did the same description today, because that is a reference to a person whose life story has, in the public perception, taken a bit of a U-turn, one might say, in the intervening years.
A U-turn in a white Bronco.
Yeah, exactly. So he was a kind of all-American. He was a comedy actor, kind of all-American sportsman, and now he's that guy who. Well, yeah, he's that guy, right?
He's that guy, yeah.
Yeah. So, like when I ran Celebrity Big Brother Dungeon Crawl, it is a joke. Obviously, it's celebrities getting killed by beastmen, but the things you know about the celebrities or the way you feel about them changes your perception of what goes on. So when Dennis Rodman got killed by a beastman, everyone felt differently about that compared to when the same thing happened to Sharon Osbourne. Now, I might for some reason really hate Sharon Osbourne and feel a rush of pleasure when she gets killed by a beastman in game, as opposed to another player who is very sad because they're a big fan of her. But the fact is that it's just the existence of them in the game and in the real world, or in some other fiction, if we're doing fictional characters. Anything like that is changing the context of not only these elements that you previously know, but it changes what's happening in the game because of your reaction to it.
Well, yeah, and we've kind of mentioned this several times already, right? Like this, like sort of your perception of things as a player changes your behavior, changes your experience with the game. I mean, for a slightly different example, maybe an example that's less comic, Hastur from the Cthulhu mythos appears in the dungeon, right? Like he's there, yellow tattered robes, crown. He's even called Yellow King and everything, right? He appears in the dungeon, and I can say he. I actually don't know if Hastur has a gender.
It's the king in yellow. So
fair
who
enough.
knows?
Yeah,
who knows?
That's a good point. But hey, anyway, whatever. I'm not standing on that. I mean, we'll say Hastur, they appear in the dungeon, and it happened in my game, like when I was playing, like, and I knew it was Hastur. I knew it. I was like, that's fucking Hastur. Like, it's definitely Hastur. And that definitely affected how I approached the situation. I was like, no, I'm not approaching. I'm not doing anything with that. I'm turning around, right? I chose that coward's path, but you could see how, like, if you didn't know that was Hastur, that would change your behavior a little bit, possibly, right? And it would change your experience. I thought it was really cool that the King in Yellow showed up in the in the dungeon, right?
Yeah, that's right. I was in a DCC game where a book by Rabelais turned up, and this is another thing that's interesting as well, right? Which is that it sort of draws attention to the fact, like a postmodern novel might, to the fact that you are participating in a game, because you then have this question, like, does Gargantua and Pantagruel, does it exist as a book in the setting, like it just happens to be the same? Or is it something, does our world exist in the setting and it's been transported from another dimension? Or is this just like, we don't need to pretend it's from elsewhere? And this is really nebulous. And like, if you've never heard of that book, you might just think it's from the game. And you'll only later when you see it on a shelf somewhere, you go, oh, right. And that is really interesting, and it's a bit like in Abu de Souffle, the film by Jean-Luc Godard, where he deliberately does jump cuts during a conversation to remind you you're watching a movie, just in case you're getting too engrossed.
Sure, yeah. As happens, right?
Well, because it's kind of a movie about a guy who's sort of modelling himself on heroes in movies, and anyway, he gets shot at the end. It's French, don't worry about it. And so that's kind of interesting, and So you've got that kind of cross-contamination, and then it comes out the other way as well. Like, I think it creates bleed into the real world. Like, let's do Celebrity Big Brother again. My mate Jay, I'm pretty sure, now has more positive feelings about former glamour model turned bodybuilder Jodie Marsh than he did before he played that game, just because he kind of, she became his main character that he was trying to have not die doing the dungeon. It's like when, being angry at someone for something they did in a dream. You have feelings about a character or a person for something they did in a game, and it's not real. It's interesting. I don't know that it necessarily has an intrinsic value, but it's an interesting thing to experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And these are all just kind of like part and parcel of what we've been kind of discussing, right? Like this sort of, and it's great. Well, so, okay. So I think we've made a pretty good case of like the pleasures of gonzo, and we've refined our definition of gonzo, which I think we needed to do, because I think some people were a little like put off by our definition of gonzo last time. We didn't even define it, actually. We just
I was trying to not define it on purpose in the past, which maybe was a little unkind.
I think we've settled on some good stuff here. Let's talk about being a good player in a gonzo setting, because I think that's the key. Yeah.
I think it's easy to ruin other people's fun if you start. Well, the things we talked about earlier, like how different people are going to be maybe engaged at different levels. I think that's important. One great thing you kind of should do is just read the room and see what everyone else is, kind of try and understand how they're experiencing the game. So if they're having fun being their character, don't try and do that kind of doing little jokes about like maybe picking apart things in their background that don't make sense. Like that. Maybe they'll be up for that next week. But if they're don't do it right now. And if you're the one doing the feelings having, try and meet the silly fun crowd halfway. Like do some, like, don't just immediately shut down any kind of bit of wit or play like that.
So that's being a good giving player. We like that. Right. That's good.
It's just being a nice person, basically. Yeah. And as we mentioned, play it straight, right? So I don't know how long that wizard was in our party, but their name was Toyota Corolla. And now I could have let that bring me out of the game and undermine my fun, going, a wizard called Toyota Corolla, that's completely unbelievable. Or, I could do what I try to do and take it as a reminder that this is a fantastical world. It's a place where Toyota Corolla doesn't have any other meaning. It's just the name of a wizard who was sort of beheaded by one of those bats from that adventure, so now has a different head, and they have an extra face on their back, and they're weird. But their name, that's not weird. Or in Apocalypse World, it's just, you got loads of those names, it's just taken as read. And that's often a pretty straight-ahead, serious game,
A side note for GMs, too. I think this is really important. A side note for GMs. Please appropriately set expectations before you begin running the game. I have been in games where the GM did not do that. And the introduction of a character, it wasn't Toyota Corolla, but the introduction of a quite silly element like that when not previously... when my expectations were not set prior to that, did kind of ruin it. Right?
Okay.
I thought we were getting a more straight down the line fantasy thing, a more serious thing. But if the GM had just said, hey, look, these are the elements of the setting, this is the kind of stuff that's going to be happening, I'd have been totally cool with it,
Yeah, I think you're right. That's the things to be aware of the tone. If it's not clear, you can sometimes find it through trial and error. Like, if people sort of get a bit annoyed at something you introduce. But you're right. Like, there are all kinds of gonzo, just as there are all kinds of things. So if you think about Elric by Michael Moorcock, that's insanely gonzo. It's full of like demons and they're traveling chaos lords and time travel and swords that steal souls. But it's absolutely doom laden and emo, and that keeps all the weird stuff. Having a single tone kind of takes all the things that otherwise maybe wouldn't really match up, but because they've got that same kind of the narrator or the characters feel the same way throughout their adventures or whatnot, that kind of unifies things in a way that maybe they wouldn't if you were not keeping your tone strictly the same all the time, but like more or less on an even keel.
Oh, you have a note here about giving the GM feedback. I thought that was interesting. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, right. So I think when you're the GM, if you are kind of picking stuff on it, hey, this looks fun, I'm going to try this. You can sometimes, basically, not everyone is going to like everything in your game all the time. that's a given. It's just, that's how statistics and people work. So it's good to just like give feedback and say what you enjoy. I think positive feedback is the bit. Don't just say like, the The dungeon with the duck theme really sucked. I hated that. Don't do that again.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe if it's like really bad. But you just say the things you liked. Like mention, man, that was really cool when we did the thing. And then like, even if they're not taking notes when you say it, you know, the GM will get a general impression of the bits that are working and that people are liking. And if you're lucky, you'll get more of that as you go along.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, so is there anything else we want to say about this topic? I mean, I think we've done a good job of like kind of setting the table for Gonzo here. What else do you want to talk about?
There's like one more thing I want to mention, which is that I think in a setting where things can be quite fantastical or change quite a lot, be it because it's like magical realist or just because it's very high weird fantasy.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's quite hard to understand the stakes of what you're doing, and it could be good to like stop and check. Like, it's a danger of always being unmoored, of knowing obviously you're never going to know what's going to happen next, but the range of possibilities is something that your character may have a more instinctive understanding than you as a player do, because not having any idea what's a good or bad idea, that's really annoying, especially if it's going to have consequences. This is why I hate dream sequences in role-playing games. Like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know I was supposed to look in the scary cave. Like, it's too abstract, so it's really good to just outright ask things like, oh, out here in this weird outer realm, can I leap incredible distances? Or if I try and jump up to that balcony, am I going to just fall on spikes and die? When we meet the dream people, can we tell from their facial expressions how they feel? Or is that just a strange magical mask they're wearing? And that might seem like a dumb question, but it's better to do that than to kind of waste your and everyone else's time and maybe just get annoyed by not really understanding what's going on.
Awesome. Great. I love it. Well, let's go to Companion Adventures. It's the Companion Adventures. Tom, why don't you start with your TV recommendation?
Okay, so for TV, I've got a Doctor Who story. It's Paradise Towers from 1987. Like all Doctor Who, it's basically not good, though it's not as bad at telling and not showing as like the more relaunched series. But it does have some striking imagery in it. It's got a factional gonzo sealed world setting. It's like a futuristic apartment block in space, and an illustration of how things can be scary and ridiculous at the same time. There's also a book novelization if you want better special effects. I haven't seen it in decades, but when I looked back at it on Wikipedia, the text there informs me that Richard Briers' performance as the main bad guy is terrible.
I can't believe that you defended Warlock of Ripoff Mountain, but you're going in on Doctor Who here.
Have you seen Doctor Who?
It's troubling. I love Doctor Who.
Oh dear.
It's your people's greatest cultural achievement, Tom.
Listeners, you are witnessing the inevitable sundering of a podcast. Oh my goodness.
I just have one companion adventure today, and that's a film called The Descent. And I didn't look up the year, but I think it's like around 2004 or so, somewhere around there. The Descent is terrific. It's probably in my top 10 horror movies of all time. A group of women, friends from college, they decide to go spelunking down into a cave, and while down there, they discover this race of kind of hideous, leathery, pale, cannibal-like creatures, and they get kind of split up. They're trapped in the caves, and these creatures are kind of hunting them down. It's very visceral. It's very intense. Great movie. But the reason why I'm calling it as a companion adventure is there is a particular keyed location in the dungeon, location number 9, where we see the sort of like giant refuse pile of the Screechmen, and that is like almost like it reads exactly how a very similar scene in The Descent looks. Okay, so if you want just like a nice visual touchstone, and then the Screechmen themselves are the Screechmen, which are a prominent monster in the dungeon. They are these creatures in this movie. Like they're almost like identical. So like if you want just like a great way of like visualizing and RPing it, great movie.
Nice. My last one, we've only got 3 between us this time around, is it a short story? Maybe a novella? I can't remember how long it is. Anyway, Red Nails, published in 1936, which was the last Conan story that Robert E. Howard wrote. And after a preamble fighting a dinosaur, Conan and his temporary sidekick for this story find themselves inside an ancient kind of sealed off city that has no opening to the sky. So it's just got roofs everywhere. There are no outer streets. It's just like massive long corridors. And it's dark, obviously. And inside are two factions of people that have been living there for a long time and are engaged in an absolutely pointless blood vendetta. And they're slowly they're down to like the last couple of dozen of each clan, and they're fighting in these dark tunnels, and there's something scary down in the basement as well. So it's, I think, an interesting model for that kind of subterranean, closed off but factionalized environment like we see in ASE.
Terrific. Well, listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a fantastic new forums. It's forums.gauntlet-rpg.com, which are absolutely bumping. There's so much activity going on in the forums. Really, really good space so far. So go check that out. And we're on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. I do want to take a moment to call out something for June on the Patreon because it's important. On June 15th, we are opening up a very large number, or larger number than we have been, a number of spaces that give you early access to RSVPing to Gauntlet online games on Gauntlet Hangouts. Those spaces are usually very, very constricted. There aren't that many, but we're opening up 75 of them, probably going to be the last for the whole year, or some of the last at least. And I'm particularly want to mention it here because the number of OSR games, both actual OSR games and the fake-ass OSR games that I do, that number has increased significantly on the calendar. And so if you are an OSR player and you're looking for somewhere to go play, we're a great bunch. So go check it out. I think that's all I've got. Tom, thanks so much.
Jason, thank you. And thank you, Lou Quaid, for editing this podcast.
Particularly this episode.
Yeah, this rambly episode. Thank you, listeners, as well.